is Jesus reinstates Peter as a follower or a disciple. Jesus reinstates Peter as a follower or a disciple. When they finish eating, fish that Jesus caught, fish that Jesus cleaned, fish that Jesus cooked, and they're sitting there eating together, Jesus is taking care of them. He's asking them questions. And he reinstates Peter as a follower, as a disciple. Peter, buddy, I forgive you. I forgive you. One of the hardest things to ask from somebody else is, will you please forgive me? Because when we ask the question, will you please forgive me, we're saying what? I messed up. I sinned. I did wrong. I shouldn't have done that to you. And in that moment, will you forgive me? It's hard for us to say to God, God, will you forgive me? Many times because we keep doing the same stupid thing over and over. This isn't Sunday morning confessional, but if we had time to sit down with each and every one of us and talk about our sin, and there's some sins we'll talk about, and there's some sins we will never talk about. But in that moment, this morning we're going to take communion. And while we're taking that time of the bread and the cup, there's a moment where you can just say, God, you forgive me? I've messed up. Is it hard? Isn't it hard to admit, God, I've messed up? But in that admitting, in that crying out, God, will you please forgive me? There's restoration. There's grace. It's that feeling of, you know what? It's going to be okay. And that grace is for us every single day of our life. A few years back, I preached on grace, and it took me 6 months, and we could have spent another 6 months just talking about grace. It's incredible to understand that God continually shows us this unconditional love, this grace, willing to restore us back as his followers. And the incredible thing is that after he restores Peter here in John chapter 21, Acts chapter 2 happens, doesn't it? It says they went together and they seen Jesus ascend to the Father, Acts chapter 1. And in Acts chapter 2, it says the Holy Spirit comes upon them, and people start to ask questions. What's going on, Peter? What's taking place? And Peter starts to go through the scriptures and shares with them how that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus was the Messiah, the one you crucified, and the one that rose from the dead. And when he gets done preaching, it says 3,000 people gave their lives to Christ that day, became followers of Jesus that day. I get excited when one person gives their life to Christ. Can you imagine how Peter must have felt to see 3,000 people say, we want to follow Jesus the way you're following Jesus? Wow. That's restoration. That's better than new. You ever heard somebody put new parts on and say, hey, it runs better than new? Not really. Still a little sloppy here or something, right? We're always comparing. When God restores you, there's no comparison. You don't compare yourself to anybody else because you're made whole and new in his eyes and in his presence. And he restores us back to the place that we once were. Third thing, and I'll close with this, is he says to him, follow me. Then I said, until death do us part. Peter, you must follow me. Peter asks a weird question. He says, Jesus describes to him that you're going to die. You're going to die a death similar to me, Peter. And by following me, people are going to hate you and abuse you. And it's not going to be easy, Peter. But I want you to follow me. And he looks back and he says, What about him? What about John? Now, John, as he's writing as the third person, I talked about this last week, is hilarious. He says, the one whom Jesus loved. John doesn't give his name. He doesn't say, hey, John was following, John was creeping. He was calling up behind him and watching him. And Peter and Jesus' conversation. He was eavesdropping. He wanted to be a part of the conversation. John doesn't talk about that. He just says, the one whom Jesus loved was following him. And Peter said, hey, what about him? Is he going to die the same death that I'm going to die? Is he going to have to suffer the same way I'm going to suffer? And Jesus looked and said, what if I want him to stay alive until I return? What is that to you? You ever compare yourself to somebody else? Compare yourself to your brothers or your sister? And your mom says to you, none of your business. What do you care if I want to bless them? What do you care if I want to give them a new toy and not give you a new toy? And we immediately say things like, it's not fair. Because we think it all has to be fair. God's always just. But the eyes of fairness, we can't always see straight. Till death do us part. When we get married, we make that commitment to one another, and we say, till death do us part. And every day of our life,